So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Simone de Beauvoir's introduction to the second sex, and we'll conclude the text today in this lecture. So we stopped at the last lecture. We stopped how Beauvoir tries to map the whole idea of equality, and she says that how certain men they talk about equality in a very ontological loose sense without really putting that into practice. And she says quite clearly over here, and this section I'm reading out for you. So it is that many men will affirm that, as if in good faith, that women are the equals of man and they have nothing to clamor for, while at the same time they will say that women can never be the equals of man and that the demands are in vain. So she's talking about the paradox over here. So how women get sort of imprisoned in a paradox by certain men who say that, women and men are equal anyway, so what's the whole need to clamor and fight and rebel for feminist rights or female rights, etc. However, when it comes to real rights, they will deny women the right. So, in that sense, that becomes a very handy tool to imprison women. It is, in point of fact, a difficult matter for men to realize the extreme importance of social discriminations which seem outwardly insignificant, but which produce in women moral and intellectual efforts so profound that they appear to spring from original nature. The most systematic of men, the most sympathetic of men, never fully comprehend women's concrete situations. So she talks about a kind of aporia, a sort of lack of communication, a crisis in communication, where men never seem to understand where the crisis of women come from, and that becomes a problem. So hence we have all this talk about men and women being equal. So what's the need for feminist movement? What's the need for women's emancipation, etc.? Where at the same time, what men fail to realize in many occasions is that there's no real rights conferred to women. There could be statutory rights, there could be ontological sort of labeled out rights, there could be rights in letter but never in spirit, and that's the whole point that Beauvoir is trying to communicate to us. So there is no reason to put such trust in the men when they rush to the defense of privileges whose full extent they can hardly measure. Right, so the whole idea of privilege becomes very political over here. So privilege becomes very gendered over here. So Beauvoir talks about how men, they rush to the defense of privileges whose full extent they can hardly measure. So and this is what we talked about in the last lecture, the whole idea of internalization. So once we internalize something, we don't realize this is an artificial privilege given to you, and that's something you've enjoyed through generations, through centuries of human history, and now we just take it for granted. Now we just think, oh, this is something I am automatically entitled to. So it's impossible for men on many occasions to really understand the full extent of the privileges and how those manly privileges are basically a denial of women's rights in the way which is completely unacceptable. Okay, so we shall not then permit ourselves to be intimidated by the number and violence of the attacks launched against women, not to be trapped or entrapped by the self-seeking eulogies bestowed on the true woman, not to profit by the enthusiasm for woman's destiny manifested by men who would not for the world have any part of it. So the whole idea of the good woman, the correct woman, the true woman, obviously is a masculine construct, obviously is a construct of male imagination, and that's something which Beauvoir says we should not be intimidated by it, nor we should be seduced by it. Although she talks about the self-seeking eulogies bestowed on the true woman. Now, obviously we talked about how the whole idea of eulogizing the true woman is basically rewarding the subject to be compliant, rewarding the subject to be, playing the game according to the manly rules. So if you become a loyal subject, if you be a compliant subject, then obviously you're rewarded for your compliance, you're rewarded for your obedience. Okay, and now she talks about how there are internal problems within feminism that needs to be addressed as well. We should consider the arguments of the feminists with no less suspicion. However, for very often their controversies the controversial aim deprives them of all real value. If the woman question seems trivial, it is because masculine arrogance has made of it a quarrel, and when quarreling, one no longer reasons well. So the whole idea of converting the feminist movement into a quarrel, the whole idea of converting the woman question into a quarrel is something which is systematically done by the masculine arrogance, by patriarchal procedures. And once it becomes a quarrel, then obviously it becomes trivial in quality. It's hard to take a quarrel seriously. So the whole idea of converting a debate into a quarrel is a very systematic maneuver made by men, and that's something that Beauvoir is addressing and unpacking. So people have tirelessly sought to prove that woman is superior, inferior, or equal to man. Some say that having been created after Adam, which is a biblical story of origin, that she's born out of Adam's ribs, which obviously suggests right away how she's inferior to man because she's born out of a part of a man in a way. So she's a metonymic construct out of a man, so she's incomplete, she's partial by default, etc. So the origin story, the Genesis story itself contains the partiality, it's embedded with the partiality of woman. So we've seen that already. So people have tirelessly sought to prove the woman is superior, inferior, or equal to man. Some say that after having been created after Adam, she's evidently a secondary being. Others say, on the contrary, that Adam was not only a rough draft and that God succeeded in producing the human being in perfection when he created Eve. So the other argument, of course, is Adam was a rough draft, Adam was an experiment, and then God created the true human being when he created Eve. Woman's brain is smaller, yes, but it's relatively larger. Christ was made a man, yes, but perhaps for his greater humility. Each argument at once suggests its opposite, and both are often fallacious. If we are to gain understanding, we must get out of these ruts. We must discard the vague notions of superiority, inferiority, equality, which have hitherto corrupted every discussion of the subject, and start afresh. So Beauvoir has very little time, has very little patience for all these ideas about inferiority, superiority, and she finds them equally reifying. By reifying, obviously what I mean is commodifying, objectifying. So that these arguments about inferiority and superiority. So when you talk about the inferiority of women, you're obviously being condescending and offensive and patronizing. But Beauvoir would equally argue that when you're talking about the superiority of women, you're being equally romanticized, you're being equally exotic, you're becoming equally commodifying. So both are fallacious and both are incorrect arguments according to Beauvoir. So we should get rid of these vague notions of equality, superiority, inferiority, and deal with the real problem of woman in a real situation, in real material conditions. So that's something which Beauvoir is more interested in, rather than this loosely formed discursive formations of inferiority and superiority, which are equally fallacious according to Beauvoir. Okay, so very well, but how, just how shall we pose the question? So how do we get to the real thing? How do we address the question as it really stands before us, the woman question? And to begin with, who are we to propound it at all? Man is at once judge and party to the case, but so is woman. So what we need is an angel, neither man nor woman. So we need a different sex, a third sex maybe. Someone is neutral to male as well as woman, right? So someone who can sit and listen to the arguments and then judge. I mean, this is obviously a very hypothetical situation that Beauvoir is suggesting, but she's making a point over here by suggesting this hypothetical diagram, as it were. Okay. Still, the angel will be poorly qualified to speak, for an angel is ignorant of all the basic facts involved in the problem. With a hermaphrodite, we would be no better off, for here the situation is most peculiar. The hermaphrodite is not really the combination of the whole man and a whole woman, but consists of parts of each and thus is neither. It looks to me as if there are, after all, certain women who are best qualified to elucidate the situation of women. So, I mean, this is a very sophisticated technique. She first talks about hypothetical situations. She says, oh, should we go for an angel? Should we go for someone who comes from outside, a neutral person? And then she quickly dismisses the idea and says that, obviously the angel is ignorant of the situation. The angel would not be situated emotionally, existentially, discursively to understand the real quality of men and women. And then she talks about, should we go for a hermaphrodite, someone who's got manly as well as womanly features? But then she dismisses that as well very quickly by saying a hermaphrodite is not a combination of a whole man and a whole woman, but a hermaphrodite is a metonymic construct, as a metonymic condition where certain parts of a woman are combined together. So that would not do. And then she comes to the real explanation and she says it's women, after all, certain women who are best qualified to elucidate the situation of women. So it is only with certain women that we get the empathy, the association, the intellectual, emotional, and existential kinship, which is necessary to understand or address or to listen or to interlocute with the woman question. Right. So that's something that she talks about very, very clearly. And then she moves on to talk about how it is important to rid us from all kinds of bias, and how bias can be a dangerous situation when it comes to the woman question. And she says this: it is doubtless impossible to approach any human problem with a mind free from bias. So it is, it is impossible, at least logically speaking, to be a completely biasless person, because every human judgment, every human intervention is from a position of subjectivity. So it is a subjective position, a subjective intervention that is always operative. So it's impossible to have a non-subjective position, a completely objective situation to any problem, to any completely objective address or unpacking or examination of any problem. So it's impossible to get a mind free from bias. The way in which questions are put, the points of view assumed, presuppose a relativity of interest. It is a calibration of interest. There's an inequality of interest. Someone is more interested in something, someone is more invested in something intellectually, emotionally, existentially than other people. So there's always a relativity of interest, and that's a presupposition we must acknowledge, right? We must acknowledge the fact that there's always a relativity of interest. All characteristics imply values, and every objective description, so-called, implies an ethical background. So there's always an ethical background, there's always a phenomenal background, there's always an emotional background, existential background to any objective situation, to any objective description. There's no such thing, for instance, as a purely objective condition, right? Because the moment you listen to it, you'll listen to it with your own mind, with your own system, with your own phenomenal being, with your own sentient self, and that obviously makes it subjective by default. So what is the way out of this? What is our way out of this, endless subjectivity? Should we deny it or should we acknowledge it? That's what Beauvoir is debating away at. And this is what she says. Rather than attempt to conceal principles more or less definitely implied, it is better to state them openly at the beginning, right? So it is better to state them openly at the beginning. It's better to state openly your subjective position at the very beginning. This will make it unnecessary to specify on every page in just what sense one uses such words as superior, inferior, better, worse, progress, reaction, and the like. So all these words which keep coming up, the moment you reveal the principles in operation, the moment you reveal and acknowledge the principles, your subjective positions in operation, then all these debates about superiority, inferiority, better, worse, progress, reaction will become redundant. It's something that Beauvoir wants to get rid of. So if we survey some of the works on women, we note that one of the points of view most frequently adopted is that of public good, the general interest, and one always means by this the benefit of society as one wishes it to be maintained or established. For our part, we hold that the only public good is that which assures the private good of the citizens. We shall pass judgment on institutions according to their effectiveness in giving concrete opportunities to individuals. But we do not confuse the idea of private interest with that of happiness, although that is another common point of view. So this is a very important point that Beauvoir is saying, and Beauvoir says that we keep hearing the whole idea of public good, public welfare, etc. But Beauvoir says quite clearly that public good can only happen according to our understanding, according to Beauvoir's feminist understanding, if it assures private good for all the citizens. So if every person is happy at a micro level, at a micro existential level, then that will obviously contribute to a broader narrative of public welfare and public goodness. So that's the effectiveness, that's the only criterion through which we can pass judgments on institutions, the effectiveness in terms of giving concrete opportunities to individuals, opportunities of growth, opportunities of welfare, opportunities of security, etc. But then she's very quick to sort of come up with the second or the caveat that we do not confuse the idea of private interest with that of happiness. It's not about happiness. It's not about happiness quotient. Private interest is a different game altogether. Private interest is about opportunities for growth. It's about opportunities to make a difference. It's about opportunities to exercise and assume agency, right? And that's something that Beauvoir is very quick to demarcate. Are not women of the harem more happy than women voters? So again, the happiness is a very fallacious argument. Happiness is a very erroneous yardstick of private good, according to Beauvoir. And she says that a woman of the harem might be happier than women who go out to vote. So happiness quotient is a very erroneous quotient to go by if we're looking at feminist emancipation, if we're looking at female liberation, etc. It's not the housekeeper happier than a working woman. So, the working woman might be more unhappy than the housekeeper. The housekeeper is perhaps more secure, more happy, more stable in her in a condition, in a situation, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a more desirable condition, the housekeeper's job, compared to the working woman. So compared to the voting woman, the woman in the harem is probably more happy, it's probably more secure, it's probably more comfortable, but that's not the point. The point about private good, the point about private interest is about opportunities, not about happiness, and that's something that Beauvoir is so clearly demarcating on this point. Okay. is not too clear just what the word happy really means, and still less what true values it may mask. So the word happiness can be a very, very deceptive condition. You can be happy without any agency at all. You can be happy without any right at all. You can just be happy because you've been rewarded for being a loyal subject. So happiness is a very, very dangerous and deceptive yardstick to go by. Actually, if you want more progress, if you want more liberation, you should be able to face unhappiness, because the more unhappy you are, the more desirous it becomes for more opportunities. So happiness can make you lazy, happiness can make you complacent, happiness can make you passive or agency-less in many conditions. So happiness is not really a reliable yardstick, a reliable parameter according to Beauvoir over here. There is a possibility of measuring the happiness of others, and it's always easy to describe as happy the situation in which one wishes to place them. So again, the whole idea comes back to the male imagination or the male fantasy of placing a woman in a condition where she is happy. But happiness is not what Beauvoir wants. Beauvoir wants unhappiness. Beauvoir wants growth, rebellion, retaliation, discontent, and only through discontent can you grow and achieve true agency and true liberation. So because happiness is something which can be acquired very easily through material processes. You take a housekeeper, you take a person in a harem, you take a woman with no agency at all and just give her something out of a reward, and that is supposed to make her happy, that is designed to make her happy. And so happiness becomes a very, very easy way out in this kind of discursive debates, and that's something Beauvoir is mentioning quite clearly. Okay, so now Beauvoir goes on to say the peculiarity which marks the woman condition. So what is a peculiarity? Now, what peculiarly signalizes the situation of a woman is that she, a free and autonomous being like all human creatures, nevertheless finds herself living in a world where men compel her to assume the status of the other. So we talked about how the production of the other is always a very handy process for any kind of control, for any kind of control narrative or any domination narrative, right? So you need to produce the other through a very systematic material process in order to promote and produce and perpetuate your authority as a figure, your privilege as a figure. So, you know, a woman live in a condition despite being a free and autonomous being like all human creatures, she finds herself as a permanent other of a certain kind of perspective, a certain kind of gaze. They propose to stabilize her as object and to doom her to immanence, since the transcendence is to be overshadowed and forever transcended by another ego, conscience, which is essential and sovereign. So the whole idea of transcendence becomes very, very problematic. The whole idea of stabilizing becomes very problematic. So again, we're back into debating what Beauvoir talks about, the problems of happiness, the pitfalls of being happy, pitfalls of stabilization. So transcendence, stabilization, these are very easy and convenient traps set by the masculinist and patriarchal perspective, where a woman is supposed to be transcending certain material orders. A woman is supposed to be moving beyond certain kind of material, earthly things, and you know, that's a kind of a value system, a virtue narrative which is created out of it. And obviously the virtue narrative is meant to imprison the woman, just so she doesn't demand what should rightfully be hers, right? So that's something that Beauvoir is very, very quick to point out in this point, in this section. The drama of woman lies in this conflict between the fundamental aspirations of every subject, which is the ego, who always rewards herself as the essential, and the compulsions of a situation in which she is the inessential. So this drama between essential and inessential, drama between the fundamental aspirations, the rightful aspirations, and the value-added aspirations, which are obviously constructed by the patriarchal perspective. And that the fact that a woman gets entrapped in these two situations, between these two situations, that dramatizes the woman's situations. That makes it a theater of conflict sometimes, a theater of conformity sometimes, a theater of conflict sometimes, but it's a theater nonetheless. It's a performative quality that Beauvoir is talking about over here. Okay, how can a human being in woman's situation attain fulfillment? What roads are open to her? Which are blocked? So this is like a spatial narrative that Beauvoir is offering before us. So what are the roads open before the woman? What are the roads which are blocked before the woman? How can independence be recovered in a state of dependency? What circumstances limit a woman's liberty, and how can they be overcome? These are the fundamental questions on which I would fain throw some light. This means that I am interested in the fortunes of the individual as defined not in terms of happiness but in terms of liberty. And that's a very, very important and a very profoundly political statement that Beauvoir is making. So first of all, she asks this fundamental question. So what are the roads open before women? Which are the roads which are blocked? And how do you navigate through all these agentic and non-agentic quantities or qualities around you? How do you navigate the permissible and the non-permissible situations in front of you? And the navigation creates or generates agency. The navigation generates a sense of rebellion, a sense of aspiration, a sense of subversion. And once you take that into account, you come to the conclusion that what you're really interested in is not happiness but liberty. And liberty can oftentimes come with unhappiness. Liberty can oftentimes come with discontent. So contentment or happiness can sometimes make you lazy, discursively or politically or intellectually or ideologically lazy, because you're just happy because you're being fed, you're being rewarded, you've been given benefits for being a compliant, conforming subject. And that's not something that Beauvoir wants. So liberty is a much more loaded term. Liberty comes with happiness. Liberty comes with the aspiration to navigate across the permissible and the non-permissible spaces, the permissible and the non-permissible parameters of value, of virtue, of morality, and obviously of the entire woman question. So what are the roads available to her? Which are roads unavailable to us, to her? And this whole idea of negotiating with the available and the unavailable becomes the process of liberty, the process of emancipation, as understood by Beauvoir and as pointed out by Beauvoir. Okay, so concludes this introduction by saying, but quite evidently, this problem would be without significance if we were to believe the woman's destiny is inevitably determined by physiological, psychological, economic forces. So if you think that woman's destiny is overdetermined by economic principles, by psychological forces or physiological forces, and overdetermination means over-influence, is something which controls entirely. So if you assume that, then obviously this debate becomes redundant. This debate becomes completely insignificant, right? So this problem would be without significance if we were to believe. So if we start with a belief system, if we start with that hypothesis that woman condition or the condition of woman is overdetermined by economic principles, forces, physiological forces, and psychological forces, and obviously that becomes a problem. We can't really move on from there. Hence, I shall discuss, first of all, the light in which woman is viewed by biology, psychoanalysis, and historical materialism. Next, I shall try to show exactly how the concept of the truly feminine has been fashioned, why woman has been defined as the other, and what have been the consequences from man's point of view. And the word fashioned is very, very important over here, because it denotes and connotes a sense of artificiality. It's something which is designed. So we talk about self-fashioning, designing yourself in order to fit into a particular narrative, or maybe subvert a certain kind of narrative. So what Beauvoir is saying over here is she's interested to find out what were the material, discursive, ideational, abstract processes which fashioned this idea of the true woman, the truly feminine woman. So what were the economic underpinnings of this? What were the ideological underpinnings of this? What were the discursive investments into this which went into the making of this fashioning of the truly feminine woman, right? So that's something she will unpack. So she's not really moving away from discursivity. She's not really moving away from the economic principles at all, but she's also careful not to let that overdetermine the woman condition. So and she's interested to find out why and how, what were the processes, material, abstract, economic, discursive, ideational, that inform this idea of woman being defined as the other. And what have been the consequences from man's point of view? From man's point of view, from the patriarchal perspective, from a masculinist perspective, what have been the consequences of this kind of othering from that point of view? Then from the woman's point of view, I shall describe the world in which woman must live, the ideal world in which woman must live, the world that woman must aspire to achieve, to acquire, through struggle, through liberation, through retaliation, etc. And thus we shall be able to envisage the difficulties in the way as endeavoring to make the escape from despair hitherto assigned to them. They aspire to full membership in a human race. So, the whole idea of membership becomes very important. Obviously, it's a very political term as well. So, in order to achieve the full membership, in order to achieve the ideal membership, the real membership, there should be struggle. There should escape. There should be move away from the hypothetical situation which has hitherto been imposed on them, right? So, they should endeavor to make the escape from the despair hitherto assigned to them. assigned to them by patriarchy, assigned to them by men. So women must liberate themselves from that sphere and then try and aspire to achieve a full membership in the human race. So the membership becomes a very important term at the end of Beauvoir's argument, and that's something that she aspires to achieve. She wants the woman to see that as a real condition, as an aspirational category. Okay, so just to, this is an introduction to book 2, with which I will conclude the lecture and conclude this particular text, where Beauvoir is saying, the women of today are in a fair way to dethrone the myth of femininity. So the whole idea, the whole myth of femininity as being this ideal, truly feminine woman, which is obviously a patriarchal myth, which is obviously a masculinist myth, and that's something that women of today are attempting, or should attempt, to dethrone or debunk the myth of femininity. They're beginning to affirm their independence in concrete ways, but they do not easily succeed in living completely the life of a human being. Reared by women within a feminine world, their normal destiny is marriage, which still means practically subordination to man. For masculine prestige is far from extinction, resting still upon solid economic and social foundations. So marriage as an institution still is a massive success. And she's saying before that the women of today, they are much more equipped intellectually, existentially, politically to dethrone the myth of femininity. It must also not be forgotten that they were reared by women who believe in a feminine world. So these women end up with marriage, which is very much a patriarchal construct, which will reaffirm and consolidate more often than not the superiority of men economically, socially, and politically. And obviously, Beauvoir is saying quite clearly that the masculine prestige, the arrogance of masculinity, the prestige quotient of masculinity is far from being extinct. And marriage becomes a very, very solid foundation, a solid, spectacular example of the masculinist economic and social foundations. If you remember the opening line of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which says, it's a truth universally acknowledged that a man, a single man in possession of a great fortune must be in want of a wife. So the whole idea of wanting a wife as a commodity, which is an extension of the great fortune, is something which has happened through generations, and that's how marriage has worked, at least in the Western liberal world that Beauvoir is addressing, Beauvoir is speaking from. So we must therefore study the traditional destiny of woman with some care. In book 2, I shall seek to describe how woman undergoes her apprenticeship, how she experiences her position, and what kind of universe she is confined, what modes of escape are vouchsafed her. Then only with so much understood shall we be able to comprehend the problems of women, the heirs of a burdensome past who are striving to build a new future. So they have inherited a burdensome past from the mothers and from the grandmothers, and that's been sort of conferred on them through the legacy of patriarchy. They have inherited the patriarchal load, the burden of patriarchy, and they must unburden themselves now and move on to a more fulfilling destiny as a more full member of a human race. So this idea of being a fuller member of the human race is something which the women are aspiring to do at this point, and they should aspire to do. When I use the word woman or feminine, I obviously refer to no archetype, no changeless essence, whatever. The reader must understand the phrase in the present value, in the present state of education and custom, after most of my commands. So she's localizing her understanding of woman. She's localizing her understanding of feminine. So she's saying that the reader should understand right at the very beginning that when I use the word woman or feminine, I'm not talking about some timeless essence of femininity. I'm talking about the current condition which produces femininity through education, through liberation, through political struggle, etc. So we need to topicalize, localize, and materialize these definitions. And before a very, very inception is pointing out this is how she means these terms, this is how she addresses and uses these terms. So one should not read these terms as some kind of a classic, timeless category. It is not a concern here to proclaim eternal verity. So Beauvoir obviously is moving away from any idea of eternal truth or eternal verity. Is that not something which concerns her at all? But rather to describe the common basis that underlies every human, every individual feminine existence. So she's talking about the more earthly, material, immediate problems which bother women, which concern women. So it's not really talking about eternal situations or timeless situations at all. And that's not something she's interested in at all, but she's more interested in looking at the urgent needs of women and how in addressing the urgent needs can we move on to a more fuller world, where women and men have equal membership, equal claims of membership on the human race. And that sense of fulfillment can come with liberation, not with happiness. And she's made a excellent point, I think, where she talks about the deceptive quality of happiness, how happiness can make you apolitical, how happiness can make you non-subversive, how happiness can make you compliant very, very easily. Whereas if you look for liberation in the true sense of the term, then you must be prepared to face unhappiness. And that's something that Beauvoir is talking about throughout this book. So with that, we conclude the introduction to second sex. So I hope you realize it's a profoundly political book which talks about the emancipation of women through histories, a study of history and a study of the future, the possibilities of the future that hold all these aspirations for women and all the things a woman can achieve through material struggle, through political struggle. And it's a profoundly political book which resonates with us in the same way as it did when it was first published in the 60s. So with that, we conclude the introduction to the second sex, and we move on to the next text in our next lectures. Thank you for your attention.